Welcome to True Crime Talks. Today we dive into a shocking affair that ended in betrayal and tragedy. Emily Harper, a recently widowed woman in her late 40s, was struggling to rebuild her life after the sudden and devastating death of her husband, Mark. The loss had left her feeling untethered, and her once vibrant home had become a silent reminder of the life she had lost. Her son, Jake, was her only solace, though he too was grappling with the weight of grief. At 22 years old, Jake was navigating the challenges of adulthood while trying to be a source of support for his mother. However, even his unwavering presence wasn't enough to fill the void in Emily's heart. Jake often sought comfort in the company of his best friend, Ryan, a young man who had practically grown up as part of the family. Ryan was everything Jake needed in a friend: loyal, dependable, and always ready with a laugh to lighten the mood. When Ryan began spending more time at their house to help Jake cope, Emily initially thought little of it. She appreciated Ryan's kindness and the way he could make her son smile even during the darkest days. Over time, though, she found herself noticing Ryan in ways she hadn't before. It wasn't that Emily was looking for anything inappropriate, at least not consciously, but as the weeks passed, she couldn't deny the comfort she felt in Ryan's presence. His charm, confidence, and easygoing nature had a way of brightening even her most sorrowful moments. Ryan, for his part, seemed to go out of his way to include Emily in conversations, ask how she was feeling, and offer words of encouragement. While Jake leaned on Ryan for emotional support, Emily began to do the same, though she kept her feelings to herself. One evening, Ryan stopped by for dinner. As Jake stepped away to take a phone call, Emily and Ryan found themselves alone in the kitchen. Their conversation started as casual chatter but quickly turned into something more personal. Ryan spoke about his own struggles with loss, how he had once felt adrift after his parents' divorce. Emily shared her feelings of loneliness and uncertainty about the future. The conversation felt surprisingly intimate, a connection forming between them that neither fully understood but both recognized. That night, as Emily lay awake in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. For the first time in months, she had really smiled, and it was because of Ryan. She dismissed the thought as a momentary lapse in judgment, a widow's fleeting need for companionship. Yet, deep down, she knew that her feelings were more than fleeting, and that realization terrified her. The line between friendship and something more blurred over time, and Emily found herself increasingly drawn to Ryan. His visits to the house became more frequent, and their interactions, once casual and lighthearted, began carrying an undercurrent of something deeper. Emily tried to convince herself that her feelings were nothing more than misplaced gratitude, a natural response to someone who had been kind and attentive during her most vulnerable moments. However, the quiet thrill she felt whenever Ryan was near made it harder to ignore the truth. For Ryan, the situation was equally complicated. He had always admired Emily, but in the past it was the way a family friend might admire someone who had taken him in like one of their own. After Mark's death, however, Ryan began seeing Emily differently. Her vulnerability and strength in the face of tragedy stirred something in him that he couldn't quite explain. What had started as an innocent desire to support a grieving family evolved into an attraction he struggled to suppress. During a summer barbecue hosted at the Harper house, the tension between Emily and Ryan reached a new level. The yard was filled with the laughter of neighbors and the smell of grilled food, yet Emily and Ryan found themselves gravitating toward one another in subtle but undeniable ways. A lingering glance here, a quiet exchange there, it was a delicate dance neither of them fully acknowledged but both participated in. When Jake excused himself to take a phone call, Emily and Ryan found themselves alone by the pool. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the water, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. Ryan commented on how well Emily was holding everything together, and she laughed softly, admitting she didn't feel as strong as she appeared. Their conversation was brief, but it carried an intensity that left both of them feeling unsettled. After that day, their connection deepened in secret. Ryan began stopping by when Jake wasn't home, under the pretense of dropping something off or checking in. Emily told herself that these visits were harmless, that there was nothing wrong with finding comfort in someone who cared. But the stolen moments they shared, whether it was a lingering touch as they passed one another, or the way their conversations grew increasingly personal told a different story. The thrill of their growing bond was intoxicating, but it was also dangerous. Emily knew that if Jake ever found out, the betrayal would be devastating. Yet, despite her better judgment, she couldn't bring herself to put an end to it. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt alive. Emily and Ryan's secret relationship was becoming increasingly difficult to hide. The intense, private moments they shared began to bleed into their everyday lives, creating an invisible thread between them that others might notice if they looked too closely. Emily grew more anxious with each passing day, fearing that Jake might sense something was amiss. Her guilt, though ever present, was overpowered by the intoxicating pull of her connection with Ryan. Ryan, too, was beginning to feel the weight of their secret. His easygoing demeanor started to crack, and he found himself dodging Jake's questions about where he had been or why he seemed distracted. Ryan's once natural presence at the Harper household now felt strained, and he often left visits earlier than usual to avoid arousing suspicion. Jake, however, wasn't blind to the changes. It began subtly, Jake noticing Ryan's quick glances toward Emily or the way she seemed flustered when Ryan was around. The camaraderie between his best friend and his mother, which had once been a source of comfort, now felt strange. Jake told himself it was nothing, that he was imagining things in the wake of his father's death, but the nagging feeling refused to go away. The turning point came one evening when Jake stumbled upon Ryan's phone, which had been left unattended on the kitchen counter. A notification from Emily popped up on the screen. Though the message was brief and vague, something about it struck Jake as odd. His mother rarely texted Ryan, and the tone of the message seemed unusually personal. Suspicion flared in Jake's mind, but he decided against confronting either of them directly, unsure if he was overreacting. In the days that followed, Jake began paying closer attention. He started noticing little things that seemed out of place: a hushed conversation between Emily and Ryan in the living room, an awkward tension when he entered a room they were in together, or the way Ryan would make excuses to leave abruptly when the three of them were together. Each observation added another piece to the puzzle Jake was assembling in his mind. Unable to shake his growing doubts, Jake decided to confront Ryan. Catching his best friend alone one evening, Jake brought up the text message and the strange behavior he had noticed. Ryan, caught off guard, stammered through an explanation, dismissing the text as a misunderstanding and insisting that everything was normal. While Jake pretended to accept the answer, his trust in Ryan had already begun to unravel. Though Jake wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was being hidden from him. His instincts told him the truth was far darker than he could have imagined. Emily and Ryan's relationship, already fraught with secrecy, began to spiral out of control as guilt and paranoia consumed them. Emily was acutely aware of the risks they were taking. Every glance, every whispered conversation, and every moment alone together felt like a step closer to disaster. She struggled to maintain a facade of normalcy, but the stress was taking its toll. Her nerves were frayed, and she began withdrawing from her usual routines, further isolating herself from Jake. Ryan wasn't faring any better. The weight of his betrayal toward Jake, his best friend since childhood, was becoming unbearable. He found himself second-guessing every interaction, wondering if Jake had started to suspect the truth. His once carefree demeanor was replaced with a constant undercurrent of anxiety, and even his attempts to act normal around Jake felt forced. The trust that had always defined their friendship was eroding, though neither of them dared to acknowledge it outright. Jake, however, was no longer in the dark. The small inconsistencies and strange behaviors he had noticed began to coalesce into a disturbing picture. Determined to uncover the truth, he started piecing together the fragments. One evening he returned home earlier than expected and overheard a heated conversation between Emily and Ryan in the kitchen. While the words were muffled, the tension in their voices was unmistakable. Jake stood frozen outside the doorway, his heart pounding as he realized his worst suspicions might be true. Unable to contain his anger and hurt any longer, Jake confronted Emily later that evening. Her initial denial only fueled his frustration, and he demanded the truth. Under the weight of his accusations and her own guilt, Emily finally broke down, admitting to the affair. The confession was like a shattering glass, irreversible and devastating. Jake's reaction was a mixture of rage, betrayal, and disbelief. The two people he trusted most in the world had deceived him in a way he could never have imagined. Jake stormed out of the house, needing space to process what he had just learned. He went directly to Ryan's apartment, seeking answers. Ryan tried to explain himself, but his words only inflamed Jake further. What began as a verbal argument quickly escalated into a physical altercation, with years of friendship disintegrating in a matter of moments. Jake left, vowing never to forgive either of them. For Emily, the fallout was immediate and devastating. Her son, her only remaining family, had turned his back on her. For Ryan, the loss of Jake's friendship and the guilt over his actions left him feeling hollow. The once intoxicating connection between Emily and Ryan now felt like a curse, one that neither of them could escape. The aftermath of Emily's confession and Jake's discovery left everyone shattered. Jake moved out of the family home almost immediately, cutting all ties with his mother and Ryan. For Jake, the betrayal by the two people he had trusted most was unforgivable. He carried his pain like a heavy weight, isolating himself from others. His once close friendship with Ryan, which had been a cornerstone of his life, was now a source of anger and heartbreak. Emily was left alone in a house that felt emptier than ever. The walls seemed to echo with reminders of her mistakes, and she found herself drowning in regret. She replayed the events over and over in her mind, questioning how she had allowed herself to jeopardize her relationship with her son. The loss of Jake's presence was unbearable, and the reality of her actions began to sink in. The fleeting moments of happiness she had shared with Ryan now felt like a cruel joke. Ryan, too, was consumed by guilt and shame. The affair had not only destroyed his friendship with Jake, but also left him grappling with the consequences of his actions. Once a confident and carefree young man, he became withdrawn and despondent. He avoided his usual social circles, unable to face the judgment of others or himself. The weight of what he had done was too much to bear, and he started to spiral into a dark place. Weeks passed, and the tension that had been simmering finally reached its tragic conclusion. Ryan was found dead in his apartment, the victim of an apparent overdose. While the authorities deemed it accidental, those who knew him suspected otherwise. The turmoil and isolation he had been experiencing were well known to those closest to him, what few remained. His death sent shockwaves through the community, and Emily was left to confront the devastating truth that her actions may have contributed to his demise. Jake, though devastated by the news, remained estranged from his mother. He refused to reach out, even as the grief over Ryan's death reopened old wounds. For Jake, the betrayal and loss were intertwined in a way that made it impossible for him to forgive or move on. Emily became a shadow of her former self. She withdrew from the world, retreating into her home and avoiding anyone who might remind her of the life she had lost. Her days were filled with endless guilt and the haunting memories of what could have been. The affair had cost her everything: her son, her peace, and ultimately Ryan's life. The story ended not with resolution, but with a lingering sense of loss. The choices Emily and Ryan had made in moments of weakness set off a chain of events that none of them could undo. What began as a secret connection ended in tragedy, leaving behind scars that would never fully heal.